Hi, so to make a scrunchie, first I'm going to summarize it really quickly, all your steps, then I will go through each step in detail. So the first thing you need to make a scrunchie is a rectangle of fabric. This example will be a tiny scrunchie, so this is only 3 inches wide and is 16 inches long. I will go through the steps and the other sizes that you can choose. This will be a small one. You have your rectangle, then you fold it in half with your right sides facing each other, your good sides of your fabric together. So you sew down this long edge. In order to get it to not move around as you sew, you pin it. Okay, this again is right sides together. Then once you've pinned it right sides together and you've sewn down the length of your tube, you'll take out your pins and turn your tube inside out or right side out. Then you will feed your elastic down through your tube. You will close together your elastic into a circle and close the loops of your scrunchie. So all this fabric will be bunched up around an elastic. On our scrunchies, we are going to be using 3 different stitches. Down the long seam of our rectangle, we will be using a running stitch. Once our tube is put together and we put our elastic through, we will be using a cross stitch on our elastic and a running stitch on our elastic. That is extra stitches to give strength and reinforcement on our elastic. Lastly, when we're putting the tube parts of the fabric together, when we're stitching those, we will be using a whip stitch to get both sides of your fabric back together and do your finishing touch. So please keep in mind the whip stitch is how we finish our scrunchie. Our running stitch is your basic seam stitch and your cross stitch for added reinforcement. So when you're sewing a scrunchie, the first thing you need to do is start with a rectangle of fabric. So the longest part of your fabric, this edge, could be anywhere from 17 inches, 18, 19, all the way up to a kind of an average size would be about 24 inches long. Okay. Then this direction, you only need to measure 4 inches down. So this looks like it's actually longer than 4 inches. And it's easier to make a pattern out of paper. So there's 4 inches. I'm going to measure again over here to make sure 4 inches. Line up my marks so that this is straight. If you are only measuring in one area, it might be 4 inches here, but you might kind of go down a hill and have it be diagonal. So as long as you're measuring in at least 2 locations, sometimes 3, you can make sure that you've got a nice even rectangle. Now 17 inches is longer than this paper, but I'm just showing you an example of how to make a pattern. So you would cut out the paper, then you can lay it over your fabric and cut out the fabric without worrying about making a mistake. Because this is just a rectangle, it's up to you if you want to go directly onto the fabric without a pattern and lay out your fabric, measure up to 17 inches or even up to 24 inches, depends on the piece of fabric you have, in length. And then in width, you want to have about 4 inches. Okay, so kind of an average size scrunchie you're looking at a rectangle of 17 inches by 3 inches. Or you can go 17 by 4 inches for your rectangle. The biggest scrunchie I've ever seen was 40 inches long by 4 inches wide as the rectangle. And that's just the rectangle shape of the fabric, okay? So whether this part is 3 inches or 4 inches, then this part could be up to you, 17. It could be bigger. It could be 24. It could be all the way up to 40. Depends on what kind of scrunchie you're looking for. Now, the second thing you'll need is your elastic. So, of course, up here, these are your fabric measurements. Down here, this is your elastic measurements. Kind of a normal standard scrunchie, 7 inches of elastic is plenty. And that also gives you an overlap amount for your seam allowance. So at the end, when you're overlapping an inch, that's plenty if you cut at 7 inches. If you have thick hair, big curly hair, or dreadlocks, and you want a bigger scrunchie, you are going to need longer fabric, but you also want longer elastic. So a 12-inch elastic is a great size for a jumbo scrunchie. And if you just lay your ruler out and lay your elastic out, you do not want to be having it in a stretched position when you're measuring it. Let it be relaxed, and you're just going to measure out to the size that you think you want and snip. So I'm going to snip this one at 7 inches, and again, that does leave me allowance for seam allowance. Seam allowance means the area where you're going to be sewing. Okay, so this is my seam allowance on elastic. This edge right here from my seam to the edge, that's considered a seam allowance. On this particular hair scrunchie, that is a very tiny seam allowance. So I would actually suggest stitching twice, doing another row here, because when you do 2 rows, you're actually saving the scrunchie from fraying. When these fibers start to fray just from washing or from use, twisting, these fibers that are actually threads that make up the cloth, they start to fray. So here is the fraying in action. Then when it gets to a seam, it can stop fraying. You tend to get a little hole, but if you have a second seam right next to it, the first seam will protect it and the second seam will be safe. One's red, one's black. And I just went down the line right next to each other. Okay, then I turned it right side out so that it's no longer an inside out tube. That part's a little tricky. You just need to be patient, and you're literally feeding it all through itself until you get to the end. Okay, just like it's a sock. And then you kind of start to peel apart and pull the good fabric back out. So turning it inside out is one of the most challenging parts of this. The sewing on this is easy, but you need to be patient when you're turning it inside out and when you're feeding the elastic. Normally you would like to use, ideally, you use the same color thread as your fabric. I've chosen a black thread so that it would show up better, and I did 2 seams. Then I need to turn my tube right side out. So this is the part that takes, I think, the most patience. You just push it right back inside of itself and start to pull it through. Do this all the way down. If you need to use a tool, you can use a pencil or a knitting needle, something to try and help poke it through. You need to be gentle as you do this. You're not going to be able to just push the entire thing through. But if you just help gently push and then you pull, pinching with my fingers and pulling through. So your tube is much longer than your elastic. Whether you're choosing a bigger scrunchie and your elastic's 12 inches, or you're doing a smaller scrunchie and your elastic is 6 or 7 inches, it's still smaller than the fabric itself. So you need two things to feed it through: a pin and a safety pin. So the straight pin will keep it from going too far down the tube, and the safety pin becomes a little anchor. You can feel it with your fingers as you're sliding it down through the scrunchie. This end of the elastic we don't want to lose, so we need to, when it gets to the end of our tube, we're going to stop and use your straight pin on the tube. Now I can feel down for my safety pin, pushing it all the way through. And out it pops the other end. Now I've got both of my short elastic sides and the fabric is bunching up around it. I can take out my straight pin, take off my safety pin, and I'm pinching the whole time so I don't lose those elastics down inside your tube. Make sure you've got both ends. Then you overlap and pin. You can use a safety pin here or a straight pin. Just make sure you're gathering both sides of your elastic. So like a full inch of overlap so that you can stitch across and back and forth. So let me show you a closer up view of that. If this was our elastic, this is paper. Pretend it's the elastic inside of your fabric, inside of your scrunchie. Make sure that you have an inch of an overlap and you pin it so that it helps hold it in place while you're sewing. And then you're going to sew in the pattern of X, X, X to really hold this. Then you're going to go back over it with some straight stitches down the middle and down the sides. Where the seam is sewn together is by far the area on your scrunchie that takes the most abuse, and you're the hardest on it. So here's an example of the fabric has been stitched down the edge. We've already put the elastic through and now we've pinned it. So we're ready to start hand sewing this pattern. We're doing X's as well as a straight running stitch because we need to reinforce this as much as possible. For example, these that I bought on Amazon or at Walmart were not reinforced very well, and so that elastic snapped in half. Here's what it actually looks like inside. They never even sewed it. It was actually hand tied. So no wonder it didn't last. It's just snapped in half. That's what fell out of the inside of this scrunchie. So I'm actually going to take this part that I will reuse and give it a stronger elastic on the inside. On the last step, do you see the difference between a folded over edge and a raw edge? The finishing touch is to get these two sides of the tube together. You essentially are putting one side of the tube inside the other side of the tube. And the one that's on the outside showing, you want to have a little bit of a fold. So pretend these two green pieces are the ends of your tube. Okay. you want one side to be going inside of the other. And then this is a raw edge. We don't want that. So before we do our stitch to get the sides of the tubes together, we need to fold a little edge, 1/4 of an inch is perfect. Then when you're sewing your tube together, you have this finished edge is all you see. Then this one side of the tube is a raw edge, but that's inside, tucked safely away. So I'll show you on the actual scrunchie. You need to fold one side under and put the other side inside of that tube. I will show you on a bigger scrunchie together. This one's ready for that. Okay. This seam inside the elastic has been sewn. Now I'm going to fold this little amount of fabric inside. Here's probably a little more than 1/4 of an inch, but that's fine. That's how much I'm going to fold over all the way around this circle, this side of the tube. Okay. Now we can pin that, we can iron that. I think ironing is the easiest because then it holds itself down after it's ironed. Now we want to make this side of the tube go inside that end that we've just folded over. So I'm pushing that in and lining up these seams. So I'm going to pin here, and I can pin through both sides of the fabric. Okay, now here's what not to do. I'm in danger of pinning correctly. I have this left side folded under, and the right side is going inside of this tube on the left. What I've done wrong, however, is I don't want to be sewing this whole thing flat. So when I pin it, I need to make sure I'm only grabbing the fabric that's closest to me, not what's closest to the table. Okay. Basically, when you sew this whole thing, you want it to be able to poof out. You're sewing this side and this side. You're going all the way around, but not sewing them together. Okay, that will look like a pancake. So I'm going to continue poking my pin in, but when I do, I want to grab this fabric on top and this fabric, which is just underneath it because it's inside that tube, but being careful not to grab what's behind it. When you're beginning sewing, you just need to be patient with yourself and feel what you're sewing and feel what you're pinning. That's why we pin, so that you're not making that mistake with the needle and thread. You figure out where you want it pinned, then you're ready to sew at the end. So now I've just realized I put this pin in and went through to that back side. I don't want to. I'm going to repin that. Hey, how do I know when I'm ready? I am done because I can pull the tubes of fabric apart, and I have not sewn them to each other, but I have sewn these two to each other. And I do have a strong elastic inside. So I'm finished. Basically, all I have to do is tie the knot at the end. So what I like to do when I'm ending a whip stitch is do one more whip stitch. And when I come through, I'm stopping before I pull that last loop all the way closed. I'm going to feed my needle through it, pull tight, that's one knot. Then I'm going to do it again. Whoops, I got caught on my fabric over here. Pull it down to about the size of a quarter or the size of a nickel. Poke your needle through. Now that is your second knot. So here are some of the scrunchies I've made. You can see I did the running stitch, the running seam all the way down. You can see the whip stitch to close both sides of the fabric together at the end. What's hidden inside is our cross stitch and running stitch reinforcement on the elastic. But these are so strong that I know that I can twist them around multiple times if I want to. I can throw them in the washing machine. I can know that the elastic inside is so strong that it won't snap. And we just need to remain patient and do one step at a time, and you'll end up with all these lovely scrunchies. These make great gifts. You can even make things that match. So if you had like a shirt you cut into a crop top and you had a long strip of rectangle fabric from the bottom of it, you could make a scrunchie to match. You could make a whole bunch for a team to have matching scrunchies, or for your homeroom.